Well, it's been a while since I've done a video on the snails, so I figured I'd give you guys an update on what's going on with them. So these are my rabbit snails, the goofy little rabbit buddies. My camera would focus. Maybe it's a little too close. There we go. They're doing so good. And there's plenty of them, honestly. Look at all the little chonkers. There's some relatively new little chonkers, too. That little guy is relatively new. Ooh, that one right there. Oh, isn't he adorable? I love their tiny little faces. They've got these adorable little black eyes. See? Right by their antennae. They're such lovable, gentle little souls. And honestly, not really much has been going on with them. They just kind of scoot around. They eat their noms, and then they go to sleep. And then that process repeats every time the lights go on and off. So at some point, I do plan on selling the rabbit snails, the young ones, when there's enough of them. Preferably, I don't want to keep breeding them in a 10-gallon tank. This really is just too small for the size of breeding that I want to do. But I have some plans in the future that hopefully will alleviate some space issues. Now, keeping them in a concentrated area like this does make it easier to feed them because, as you can imagine, these guys are pretty slow. They're not like a typical mystery snail or even just a ramshorn or a bladder snail. They don't make it very far very quickly. So when it comes to giving them a specialized diet, having them in an area where I can feed them all at once certainly helps. And even then, they don't always eat all of their food, and when that happens, it gets moldy and I have to remove it. So, yeah. Plus, that builds up ammonia, and, well, I don't like doing that. Snails, they're not the most sensitive creatures, definitely not like my shrimps. But, yeah, anytime you can just keep the water quality constantly good, rather than having to do water changes to fix whatever issues may arise from the natural nitrogen cycle. I think that's better. But you'll notice there's not really any plants in here, and that's because, well, snails don't particularly care about plants for the most part. Now, the thing about rabbit snails are they are so big that when it comes to rooted plants, they have a tendency to kind of uproot those those smaller plants. If they're not anchored into like a super deep substrate, because rabbit snails make trenches everywhere they go, that can be a problem. So in a tank that's dedicated to breeding them and ensuring that they're getting fed well, plants would just get in the way. There is the possibility of floating plants, but at that point, you're dealing with either my personal favorites are Sylvania minima. Relatively easy to deal with, but they don't really care for surface agitation that much, and I hate duckweed because that stuff just gets everywhere and it's a pain in the butt to remove. So, plants, kind of that kind of category. I've got plenty of a particular plant that doesn't take root and it doesn't float. And that's what I use in most of my shrimp tanks because it's easy to maintain and it grows relatively quickly. So it does a decent decent job at controlling the amounts of nitrate that builds up in the shrimp tanks. But honestly, I feel like that would just get in the way of the snail's surface area that they'd like to have to move around in this tank. So I kind of just leave it relatively bare. I need to make some Snello, some snail jello, which is something that I haven't made ever since I stopped breeding mystery snails like a year or two back. So snail jello is pretty simple to make. It's just a bunch of high calcium veggies, some baby foods, some plain jello mix, and some specialized bottom feeder food. and you can make them like little cubic chunks that you throw in once in a while, and all the snails will go crazy for it. I should probably... I made a tutorial a long time ago, but I could always update that tutorial. But for the most part, they eat their sinking pellets, which are pretty high in calcium as well. And the one thing I really like about breeding rabbit snails, rather than getting them from a pet store or even, just distributing them like pet stores do, is because they're born in my tanks, I can really dial in their diet to ensure that they get super high quality shells. Like, you can tell which ones were born in here, and it'll be like that regardless of how big they get. Because my water is extremely hard. It's got tons of calcium in it. And it's also a very high pH. So if snails are in acidic water, that could erode their shells. My water is very alkalitic. And I feed them very high calcium food. So their shells, unlike their parents, won't have the problems of pitting or erosion like you see right there. That's one of the mama snails that I've had for a while. And you'll notice on these ones there's a lot of pitting and erosion. And part of that is because a lot of these snails are still sourced in the wild. You see, because they breed so slowly, which is not what their name would suggest, considering they're called rabbit snails, it's just not worth it to a lot of people to breed them in captivity, just because it takes a while to build up stock and then to have enough room to properly breed them and feed them. And the value of a rabbit snail that is this particular color, the orange ones are worth more than the yellows or the black ones. So the orange typically sell anywhere from $10 to $15 at a local pet store around my area, which is not a lot of money. So the return on investment's not that great because of the excessive amount of time it takes compared to something like a shrimp. So for that reason, it's just one of those things where it's more of a passion project for me, because I really like rabbit snails. They are my favorite snails. They breed slow. They do a good job. They do the same thing that Malaysian trumpet snails do, which is aerate the sand, without becoming a total nuisance. So they're kind of the best of everything. They're goofy and big and lovable, like a mystery snail. They're beneficial to sand substrate tanks, like Malaysian trumpets are. And they still breed in freshwater, so you can always have a male and a female have some babies every once in a while and get to enjoy the little chonkers as they grow. So I think they're relatively close to the what I would consider perfect freshwater snail. So, they do as they do, and they're fun. So that's just an update on these guys.